This is Power BI and more from CRM Audio with your host Ulrik Carlson. This episode is brought to you by CRM UG. The Dynamics 365 user group is the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members have a common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. We thank Dynamics 365 User Group for sponsoring Power BI and more from CRM Audio. Welcome to Power BI and more. Ulrik, it's good to talk to you. It's been about 2 months since our last episode. I think conference season has made everything extra busy lately. So how you been doing?
Yes, absolutely. That's been both the CRM UG Summit, there's been Extreme 365, but conference season is over and we are back at it.
Great. So you've had an extra busy conference season. I believe you led every Power BI session at Extreme 365?
Yes, I believe so. There were some other analytics-oriented sessions, but when it comes to using Power BI with Dynamics 365, I had the two main sessions on that at that conference. And this time we actually focused on a few different things because we've been probably beating the dead horse about how do you retrieve data from Dynamics and get it into Power BI, right? And we've been talking about all the various ways of doing that. And to be fair, that is still where a lot of people who get started with Power BI needs to start and work with and get a good idea of the different methods and the ways to do it, because that's where you can end up wasting a lot of time and not completing your dashboard if you don't get the data right. But here at Extreme, we took the step further and we talked specifically about security and how to use our Dynamics 365 security in Power BI. Basically some of the same methodologies that we talked about in one of our previous sessions where we focused exclusively on the security side of things. So it's good to actually show that to a live audience at a dedicated session, as opposed to being a miniature part of other sessions that I've been doing. So we can use some of these, the user principal name and retrieve the information about the customer, but actually do a deep dive on that whole area and get some feedback on it. And I feel that was one of the areas that people were most interested in when it comes to using Power BI, because we have this complex situation where we have all of our security set up in Dynamics 365. We do a lot of requirements gathering on it. We set it up, and then we do this analytical side of it on the same data. And of course, I guess you can say, of course, you'll assume that people will expect the security to apply, the one that you already set up and probably spend a lot of time on managing, will apply to that same data set. Whereas in reality, in Power BI, it is technically a different set of data that you're looking at, and of course has its own security implications and the ways to work with it. So yeah, we got to talk about the different ways we can frame that conversation too, in terms of only bringing in the fields, controlling exactly what data is being shown. You can show aggregate data and opportunities and activities, for example. So you can show total amounts of opportunities, estimate revenue for certain teams, even though your users don't have access to the individual records, which is interesting. That's usually one of the requirements too with reporting in Dynamics is, you want people to have an overview of what's going on in the organization, but you don't want to have them be able to see the details. And with the charts and dashboards inside Dynamics, there's an assumption that if you want the aggregate information, you need access to the record. So we actually get some extra flexibility in using Power BI and showing those visuals. And
right. That's great, because you may want to show overall trends without showing the granular records. A lot of people with orders or those types of things or opportunities don't want to show the individual opportunities because that could lead to problems, but we want to show overall what's our pipeline, and so that's great that you can do that.
Right, and I think one thing that was interesting here when I was going through my setup and my demo, I've been using the same security Power BI file for a while now, and I was updating it. Of course, I was updating it the night prior to the presentation and making sure everything was working, and all of a sudden there was actually a few things in the query that wasn't retrieving the way I wanted it, because I'd been updating my Power BI desktop client, and when I originally created this, it was on a previous version. So essentially I needed to update some of my queries, which all sounded simple enough. The challenge though was, especially with the security data, we have to pull in all the users, of course. We have to pull in all the roles, the security roles. We have to figure out who owns what role from that relationship. We have to figure out what privilege you have for each individual role, and for all the read privileges, who can read accounts, who can read opportunities, etc., and at what level. And that was actually a query that was very complex to do, and I really did it just bringing in all the different tables and I connect them. And the problem when I connected and did that with OData, or the standard connector basically, just creating that merge table took half an hour, 45 minutes of it, just merging the data and all these different data and putting all these different tables together. So that was a very long process to do that. And my thinking at the time there was, because it was getting late, and I was just basically wanting my same demo to work, right? So I could update a user, change the security role, and we would see the access level change in Power BI at the same time. Now, over the past year, we made the Power Query Builder tool for the XM toolbox. We talked a lot about using Fetch XML instead. So what I actually did, instead of just spending this like almost an hour on just trying to merge a couple of tables or a number of tables, I tried to create the same query with one Fetch XML statement. And of course, I used Jonas Rapp's Fetch XML builder to do that. And turns out that I've actually never used it to this extent before, where it actually enabled me to go in and look at the privileges, and basically trickle through in the fetch via linked entities to go find the role, go find the users, etc., and actually create that whole same table with the user information, the privileges, etc., via one Fetch XML statement, going through these 4 or 5 different tables and bringing in details from each of those tables, and pulling that into Power BI via one query. So this is actually like 4 or 5 queries, separate queries that I could now just do with one query, and it would load in minutes, as opposed to the 45 minutes, etc., that it took me to just merge the different tables once I'd already created them. So there's definitely some capabilities there in the Fetch XML builder, and using Fetch with Dynamics 365 that I wasn't even aware of until I ran into this situation, and that kind of deep querying and say, we have bring in these tables, we need these other fields from other tables, and kind of do some of the things that.
Why was your fetch so much faster than the Power Query?
So the query itself, I guess the Fetch XML is a part of the Power Query.
Okay.
So we use basically the Fetch XML inside the Power Query. So the Fetch XML is the way that we retrieve the data. Of course, the other way would be the OData connection. So the OData is generally just slower than using the Fetch. And it's actually significantly slower because it actually pulls a lot more data. But in this case, instead of pulling 4 or 5 different tables and merging them, and using a lot of processing power on my desktop to merge those tables in Power BI, I basically had one query that queried the different tables and brought in the details that I needed. And I could immediately start working with it and do what I needed to get that security information out of it with a much, much simpler query and working much, much faster than trying to retrieve all the pieces individually.
So when you do Fetch XML instead of the OData query, are you limited to the aggregate result limit of Fetch?
So you think about the 5,000 per page record limit? No, we can go well beyond that. I think the max I've retrieved with Fetch is about 2.5 million records.
Wow. Okay.
Once we kind of hit, I would say once we hit the million, or above, you probably want to consider different methods regardless, including also not using the standard connector or OData. But yeah, I've retrieved those kind of numbers with fetch.xml, and depending on your situation, what you're doing, this kind of state where I need to query something from different tables, etc. This was significantly faster than trying to use OData, and also retrieving much less data out of the system. Plus, the kind of querying that I was doing inside the, looking at different tables and filtering from different tables within the same query is not something that's possible to use with OData. We would have to do that on a per table basis.
Okay, so why did you have to do this the night before your conference? I hope you also installed the big Windows update as well right before the presentation.
So
exciting.
I fell into the trap of having had a presentation that I've done a number of times, and then I was just going to assume that even though it's been a few months since I last did it, that everything was still working as planned, right? So I read it up, make sure I load it, and I think I was in that, and you're probably familiar with this. So you're there the night before, and there's this one thing that doesn't work for real, and you can fix it, and you can probably spend a lot of time the night before on fixing it, or you can just, in this case, I actually didn't have to update it in order to demo what I needed to demo, but I just really wanted it to work for real when I was demoing it. So that's kind of how I ended up doing it, and I'm glad I did, because I wasn't actually aware to the extent that we could use the fetch XML builder to create these very complex queries and then copy them into the Power Query builder and basically use those directly inside our Power Query and retrieve all the data in that capacity. I think that kind of opened up this whole new world of things that we can do and how we can actually pull the data, as opposed to having to use these other methods and bringing in 5 different tables individually. That probably isn't needed when we could do it in this way.
That's great. And that's a great topic. And if you're interested to know more about the fetch XML generator or the XRM Toolbox, just mention we have the XRM Toolcast, and this week we're going to have the second episode from the XRM Toolcast. It's a good episode. I'm not going to tell you more about it. You'll have to listen. So right. What other questions did people in the audience at your sessions at CRMUG Summit or Focus or at the at the Dynamic or at the Extreme 365? What did they ask you?
So at Extreme 365, I think I had the most questions on the security and how to use it, and that page options like the record limit on fetch.xml, that one came up again, how many, we have all these limits, you can max get 5,000 records, but we have that pagination option there that we're using in the query, which was developed by Keith Mesher and that original Power BI accelerator tool that basically lets us go beyond that limit. So that's something that came up quite a bit at the CRMUG. That's where we were focusing more on how to query the data, and it's interesting that we've talked a lot about option sets, right? We kind of beaten that horse to death a couple of times too. But it's still something that's going on and everybody's talking about, because everybody hates option sets when it comes to pulling the data into Power BI. That's where the fetch XML could be a huge advantage, because you get that display label or the formatted label of the field instead of the individual value. And I think this is one area that I believe is going to be really interesting for us to work with, because here in 2018 and prior, back in 2017, we had the standard connector and the OData connection. We're working with that. I feel here in 2018, we started working a lot with using fetch XML to get the data into Power BI. And now we have the CDS connector that we can use too. So actually, if you go into Power BI or data flows, which we're going to talk a little bit about, we can actually connect to our Dynamics 365 data with the CDS connector in Power BI, and that one actually also retrieves the display labels from the option sets without any additional work.
Nice.
Joel, have you had a chance to try that one out?
No, I haven't. I have tried the CDS connectors for Flow and for Power Apps. I know that those are become my go-to connections instead of the Dynamics 365. Let me ask you this. Is there any limitation currently in the CDS connector compared to the Dynamics 365 customer engagement connector?
So they're different because... And I think maybe we should highlight when we talk about CDS here, the Common Data Service, we are actually connecting to the exact same data, right? It's just different ways of connecting to it, and CDS, the Common Data Service, is essentially the same database that we log into and retrieving the data. So the CDS connector brings in, when you use it in Power BI, it will actually ask you a couple of questions when you query the data. And all you have to do is put in the UL for the data. You don't have to look up that whole /API/version, whatever. You just put in the URL. I love
that long URL. That's awesome.
Yeah, so you know what? I since I've learned it by now to like type it in, it's.
You could probably type with your eyes shut, I bet.
Yeah, so you know now we have that syntax down, and then they're making it all easier, right? So you just have to put in all you have to do is remember the UL for your CRM system, and then you can start using it. It asks you a couple of questions, and one of those questions is, do you want to order your data? You can say true or false. You would have to type in true or false to say that. So basically gives you the fields in an alphabetical order. And then there's a question about including display labels, which is the display labels for the option set. If you type in true, you will automatically get all those option set labels included inside your query. So you get, similar to the fetch, you get two fields for every option set, one with the value and one with your display label automatically. So that's all being brought in, and this connection is actually super fast. It is almost as fast as the using fetch XML. Those are very close to each other.
If you're on version 9 and you have the Common Data Service, is there any reason why you would use the older connection?
The OData connection? So the standard connector brings in, so you can say the CDS connector and you select accounts. With the CDS connector, you select get all the fields from accounts, but only the fields from accounts. So if you have your lookup, for example, to primary contact, all you're going to get from primary contact is the unique ID for the primary contact. You're not going to get the name. If you use the standard connector, you're going to get the unique ID for primary contact, and you're also going to get an expandable field with the relationship to primary contact, which you can expand and include in the full name and other details from the primary contact. Now, that's a method that we in general have been saying do not use, because that is very expensive from a performance point of view, so that can significantly slow down your connections if you do those kind of expands. But it is nice if you have limited amounts of data, etc., to be able to bring in those, the name of the contact. If you retrieve all your contacts opportunities, you can very easily bring in the name of the account, for example, with the standard connector. That is not an option when you use CDS. You're only getting data that's on that table specifically. So that's a significant difference.
At some point, I mean, because I can imagine scenarios where you'd be confused of which should I use, and see, okay, I got some option sets, so that CDS would be better, but I also need some additional data that the OData connector can get me. So how do I make a decision which one I should use?
All right. So you actually have in the CDS connector, when you connect to CDS, you actually have two sets of tables to choose from. You have the CDS, and you have on that, it just says system on there. So if you select the system option, you get all the entities, schema fields. It basically mimics the old OData connection. So that one is actually included there when you use the Power BI desktop client. So you can actually get access to some of those features still. And what's a little bit interesting is that you can actually see that there's a difference in the amount of entities and fields that you can connect to with either. So if you look up the standard CDS connector, you have however many, 300 and some entities, etc. If you install a trial with all the different items, you can actually see that you have less entities in your CDS connector than you do in the same one with the system. So there might be some behind-the-scenes system entities that you cannot access with CDS, but in general, when you use the CDS connector, you retrieve the data much, much faster. And it probably contains 99%, if not 100%, of the data that you are likely interested in. So you actually get both benefits
with the CDS connector, like with the Power Apps and Flow connector. Are there any restrictions? Like, does it verify licensing? So, for example, the CDS connector for Power Apps, you can't do cases unless the user is licensed for cases. Does it have that same kind of logic?
That is a good question. So, when you log in with your credentials. So, I'd assume it would give you access to everything.
Okay. So, I had a question that came from somebody who's listened to the podcast, and that is, the Organizational Insights database, now that it's, or dashboard, especially now that it's at the Power Platform Admin Center, is awesome. And they've been adding a lot to it, so it's really useful. But a lot of people want to be able to take that data and build their own dashboards or build it in with other metrics that maybe aren't in there. So question is, how do you get to that data? Where does it live, and what can we do with it?
Right. So it kind of lives in its own database, and I think it's some data that I think will be very nice to get your hands on with Power BI, so you can correlate it with record ownership and so on, and like get some very granular insights into how people are actually using the data, who's creating their own views compared to who's actually using and looking at records and updating records. The challenge, though, Organization Insights, you can find it on the Microsoft website. They have a very specific way where you can basically get to the individual data sets by creating these long OData queries where you have to add in your organization ID, and then you have some visuals ID, etc., that you can connect to. However, that process doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So you have to do these hoops and use like a web connection to try and get to the data. And I'll give you some additional methods of trying to work with the data and essentially get access to it in Power BI. I would say that's probably not worth doing right now. It's one of those areas where these are fairly new features, and I think in accordance with everything else we hear when it comes to data and Dynamics 365, that if it's not accessible to get to the data, it's something that will become accessible, like this whole open data initiative and free the data. So while we don't believe we have a connector right now that'll make it easy to get to, it should be something that is coming right now. But it's also one of those areas we see a lot of transition on Organization Insights. Where it used to be inside Dynamics, now it's in the Power Platform. It looks similar, but it's not exactly the same.
So I guess the question is, if today you wanted to do user adoption type dashboard, you got audit data and the user access data from there, but but the problem with that is that it's got a lot of noise in it. If you use Outlook, every time you start Outlook, it's going to create a record in there, even though you didn't. You'll say you used it 5 times. So Organization Insights is kind of it's smartly not picking up all that noise. It's giving you more real data. I think it's based off some of the same things as the user access. But then you've also got these new Office 365 audits that give you some really, really good stuff about who's viewed what records. That would be really useful. What would you do today if somebody said, I want a dashboard showing who's using the system?
All right, and you also have the Azure Application Insights, right?
Okay.
That may give you some additional data if you implement that. What I would do today, I would probably look at a combination of what I get from Organization Insights and basically use that separately, and then have my own visualizations that I can make in Power BI. Probably also I could do with charts and dashboard is looking at, when it comes to user adoption, who is creating views, for example, who's creating their own charts, who's creating their own dashboards. That's not necessarily something that you usually get a statistic on, or you would have to log in as that person to see what they're actually creating. But you can actually use the Power BI to retrieve that data and see, not just necessarily looking at Organization Insight, who's logging in and who's using it, but also who is augmenting the system and creating their own views and helping modify it, so you can identify those individuals. Or talk to the people who are not doing any of those things at all, but maybe just looks in and read. So unfortunately, I don't think we have a single repository right now. You have to look in a couple of different places in order to do that. But I believe that is something that is coming. my personal speculation that we'll be able to get access to that data at some point.